right, well, hello and good evening. It is an honor to be with y'all today or this evening. Like Jeff introduced me, my name is Alyssa Aldape. I am the faith organizer at Americans United, and like he said, I can talk about this all night, all day. I'm a certified yapper, and I have a mic, so God be with us all. All right, so tonight, we will be talking about Christian nationalism, the very light and breezy topic of Christian nationalism. And so our goal for tonight really is to understand a definition of white Christian nationalism and deepen our understanding of the history. Because we know this didn't happen overnight. This didn't happen with Project 2025. This didn't happen in 2016. This has been decades in the making. And like we talked about earlier today at dinner, I think topics like this can be very scary because we don't know what it actually means. We don't know what the tenets are. We don't know where it begins. And so sometimes it's easier, right, to stick our heads in the sand. But when we have the tools to understand and to name it, it has less power over us. And so this is an opportunity for us to be able to name those things, to call it out, and be able to then make it plain for the rest of our community to continue to combat Christian nationalism in our own communities and in our own words. And I think that's very powerful. Sorry, I'm out of breath already. All right. All right, so a brief introduction to me, like I put in the slides. So I am a pastor. I'm an organizer, an Enneagram 3 for any Enneagram heads out there, or Enneagram 1. And I'm also a recovering preacher's kid. So both my parents were first Baptist pastors, and then they became missionaries. So I never had a chance. I was going to turn out into some type of ministry role or become a rebel in some way, or maybe a little bit of both. So my background, I grew up in Texas. I primarily grew up in South Texas, in the Hispanic Baptist churches of Texas. Now, well, it's complicated, actually. All right, so, and to give some background about the Hispanic Baptist churches of Texas, the Hispanic Baptist churches were a mission of the Southern Baptist Convention, because in the mid-1800s, the Southern Baptists started realizing that there was, one, a rise of Mexican immigrants coming into South Texas, into Texas, and two, they were Catholic, and that was an issue. And so thus began the great mission of converting the idolatrous Catholics into good old Baptists. And I am a result and a product of that mission. My grandparents immigrated to America in the 60s, and it was through the missionary work of Baptist missionaries in South Texas that my grandparents converted to being Baptist. Because for them to be a good American was to be a Baptist. Therefore, leaving behind our culture, our identity that was found in ties to Catholicism. And so there's a little something that was lost in that. And so there's kind of a bittersweetness to that origin for me and what that meant for me. So it's very, if you're ever in Texas and you kind of see First Mexican Baptist Austin or First Mexican Baptist San Antonio, that is a Baptist mission or Southern Baptist mission of the Hispanic Baptist Church. And so I grew up in First Mexican Baptist Church of San Antonio. And it is in those churches where I heard people who spoke like me, who sung hymns like I sung hymns with my grandma, who read scripture in Spanish, who taught me how Jesus loves me in Spanish. But the pictures of Jesus on the walls and in the stained glass were all of white Jesus. And so you can imagine as a child being told, it is important to be like Jesus and to act like Jesus and embody his character, but at the same time, seeing your own brown reflection in the pictures of a white Jesus. So holding those two things together was a little difficult, and we're in therapy now about it, but we understand that, this understanding of a white Jesus, what does that do to a small child who will never be white Jesus? And so that's where I'm coming from, and I named that because the thing I want to name for us tonight, I know we all come from different faiths and philosophies. A few of us here identify as people of Christian faith, and maybe even some of us identify as progressive people of progressive Christian faith. But I want to name that doesn't absolve us from our own roots of Christian nationalism, because there's still some there. And so again, it is important that we unpack the roots and the history of Christian nationalism, to recognize it, to name it, not just in the world and in our government, but also in our own understanding, in our own theological worldviews. So that's a little bit of my own story. All right. I'm so glad you have your own slides, because I would have forgotten to say next slide now. All right, so for a little, this is another Baptist joke, so a little talk back with the, with the congregation or with the group. So when you think of white Christian nationalism or Christian nationalism, what comes to mind? And feel free to shout out some terms, and I'll try to repeat them in the mic so others can hear. The KKK? Okay, what is that? Extreme? All right, there were multiple. Who said that? It's Merry Christmas. Oh, that's a good one. Not Happy Holidays, it's Merry Christmas. All right, what else? I heard something over here. Born again. MAGA. Okay. Exclusion. Theocracy. Gulf of America. Misogyny. Moral superiority. I heard patriarchy or patriarch. What else? These white. Okay. Yeah, white Christian nationalism. White. And then yeah. Karen. You know, one of my dearest friends is named Karen. Poor thing. And she is the kindest person in the world. She once, towed my car at 2 a.m. on 285 in Atlanta. And I like to call that Karen behavior. But yes, okay, thank you. So I encourage you to hold on to those terms that you've heard and see where they pop up later on in our presentation. So thank you for shouting those out. All right, so what is Christian nationalism? Now this definition comes directly from the Americans United website. I'm sure we have all Googled what is Christian nationalism, and I'm hoping that what you have found on the internet has come up with this, similar to this definition. So white Christian nationalism is the dangerous belief that America is and must remain a Christian nation founded for its white Christian inhabitants, and that our laws and policies must reflect this. So, yeah, I think I just heard it over here. Yep. Yeah, same. All right, so now that we have like a basic broad definition of white Christian nationalism, let's go over the tenets of Christian nationalism. So it is the belief that America's founding is rooted in Christianity. The U.S. is fulfilling God's promise on earth, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The superiority of white Christians and their cultural values over everyone else. Conservative Christian beliefs are the cornerstones of American identity. The defense of traditional gender roles and the nuclear family, with men as the breadwinners and the women as caretakers. Yuck. The rejection... Everybody can be a caretaker. The rejection of non-Christian religions, secularism, and progressive values, the emphasis on law and order, and the use of state power to maintain the social hierarchy, and the support of anti-immigrant policies and nationalism. Has anyone seen any of this happening in real life at the current moment? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Right. So, again, I want us to keep these in mind as we continue to go through and see again that this did not happen overnight, but decades in the making. It kind of reminds me of that term about, the frog boiling in the hot water, or cooking in the hot water, and before they know it. Which apparently my best friend Lauren's father, who's a farmer, says that's not actually how you cook frogs, but it works as an analogy.
Yeah, that's next month.
That's next month. So please come back next month for that talk. All right. So, like we just mentioned, we had Melissa asked me earlier about U.S. What was the question? What was the?
Well, it was the second tenet is like the U.S. is fulfilling God's promise on earth.
Right. Right. That's a great question. So, like I mentioned, this did not just start with Project 2025. So I'm going to go through a very brief timeline about the foundations and the genesis of Christian nationalism. And so apologies for nerding out on a history timeline here. But we're going to start back all the way to the 1600s, and I would even dare say the 1400s. So, yeah. So we're on the history of Christian nationalism slide, for those of y'all who are sliding on your phones.
The one with the chart.
Yes, the one with the chart. Oh, gosh. Okay. All right. All right, so we'll start with the first one. So if you slide once, the first one should pop up. All right. So, we're going to begin with colonization. As we all observed yesterday, yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day, or some like to call it Columbus Day. He didn't discover anything. But we talk about that day, and we talk about kind of the genesis of colonization. So that happens in 1492, as we know from the poem. So in 1493, it is Pope Alexander VI who comes out with the papal bull Doctrine of Discovery, which is essentially the idea that any European Christian white country that discovers or encounters a land of a people with its inhabitants that are not Christian, that are savage, can be claimed for God and for the country of whoever claims it. So in the late 1400s, in 1493, the Pope has this declaration essentially giving European countries the right justified by the Pope and by God, saying you are now allowed to conquer any land in the name of God and country. And so we have this as the origin, right, of, where does this come from? And it comes from the very roots of colonization, right? And so ideology is influenced by colonialism and using scripture as a justification for the slavery and for the raping and pillaging of peoples of the New World, of the Americas, and of other countries. And so kind of that's where the origin begins for at least this country, right? And so that's what we're talking about today. So we move on to the 1800s, and it's a doozy of a century. All right, so where I want to kind of focus on right now in the 1800s is we talked earlier about Baptist history, but I know we're Methodist friendly here, so we can talk about Baptist history later. But what we want to really understand about American history in the 1800s is that the country of America is expanding. So we have the Louisiana Purchase at the beginning of the 1800s. Mid-1800s, we have the Mexican-American War, where land is taken from Mexico. That is another part of my family history, where my family land was also taken during the war. And so that we have the expansion of American land there. And we also have manifest destiny, which is the doctrine, right, of Western expansion, and we have this again the other justification tied together with God and country of this is our land and God wants us to conquer it, and so it is this rooted in a theology of white supremacy that then justifies people conquering and stealing land, going west. I'm sorry.
Kind of like American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
Related.
Yes. Right, exactly. Right, so we see this doctrine of discovery late into the 1800s with the above, like I mentioned. Also to note, what's also happening at this time. So we have the Manifest Destiny, Mexican-American War, land expansion to the west. We also have happening in the middle of the century the Civil War, right? And so the Civil War, the religion of the lost cause. So this idea that they might have lost this war, but it was for a righteous cause. Certainly not about slavery. It was about states' rights. And so we have this idea that this Civil War was a righteous war fought for God and for freedom of country. And what's interesting about this particular part of history is at the end of the Civil War, Confederate soldiers, there is a group of Confederate soldiers that escape the South and escape into South America to Brazil. Now, what's fascinating about this is that there are communities of people who claim Confederate and Southern roots, but have created villages and communities in parts of Brazil that were then considered, again, Southern Baptist missions to then continue to convert the idolatrous Catholics in Brazil to the good and right religion of baptism. And so, oh gosh, what was the previous president of Brazil? Bolsonaro. So Bolsonaro's religion of conservative evangelical Christianity, that particular type of Christianity is a direct root of that Southern Baptist mission post-Civil War, when you have Confederate soldiers who escape to the South, or to South America. Yes?
I've never heard this religion of the lost cause. Is that associated only with the Confederacy? They did both sides?
Yeah. So yes, so the religion of the lost cause is this idea, right? So the Civil War was this lost cause of the South, but it was a righteous cause, right? So you kind of have the... So you have this founding, you have the 1800s of where, so that is all happening, and also in the midst of this, the founding of the Southern Baptist Convention that is happening in this era as well. Now, so I did mention Manifest Destiny, and I want to invite you to look at the picture that I have in the slides here of the portrait. And I want us to focus on Columbia, which is the angel, the name of the angel itself. What do we notice about Columbia? White, okay.
Carrying electric lines, power lines.
Okay. Kind of angelic. White. Grecian, okay. Did somebody say something on here? No. I'm sorry, what was that? Right, she's larger than everyone else, so she is the focal point of what we should be focusing on. Yeah, thank you. Anything else? What was that?
She's carrying the lines of communication.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Excellent. These are great points. So, and she has a school book. Right. So everybody else in the, she's, again, like what we heard out here, she is the focal point, right? Columbia, the angel, the Manifest Destiny, she is the focal point of Manifest Destiny. And what's really interesting about this particular portrait of Columbia is this idea that this dream is something that needs to be protected. It's angelic, and it is a white woman. And so this idea begins of that the American dream, or like where we get the American dream, or this understanding of, God's dream of America being conquered by good Christian white leaders, is that this dream is something that must be protected because it's so delicate. And so when we kind of think about this idea of the history of how white femininity was also tied into the roots of racism in this country, we kind of see those roots in Manifest Destiny and how it is portrayed through art. And so that's really interesting. Who said the lines of communication? Or yeah. So she's carrying the line of communication, right? And so this idea that what are we trying to communicate when we talk about who gets to represent the American dream, or who gets to represent the conquering of this land. What I'll never forget about this particular painting. So when I took Texas history in 7th grade, because that is a class you have to take in Texas, this was one of the first times that the teacher, Ms. Holland, shout out to her, this was one of the first times she kind of invited us to think critically about who gets to represent history and who gets to have a face in history. And again, I remember this because I always tie it back to the understanding of white Jesus on the wall and what it meant to be a good person of faith. And so seeing this picture in 7th grade and thinking, what does it mean to be a good American? And who gets to represent that story? And so I'll never forget that lesson in Texas history.
The artist was also probably paid by an organization to present that idea.
Yeah. Ooh, interesting. That's next month's topic.
I'm
Write that down. Yes, so our friend Melissa said it could also be really interesting to talk about who commissioned the painting for the artist, or who asked the artist to paint this and commission this particular piece. Thank you. And so this moves us on into the 1920s. So, like I mentioned, so we have the War of the Lost Cause, the righteous cause that happens. Famously, the South loses the Civil War. That's not really taught. That's not something that was historically celebrated. And so it is not until the early 1900s where there are groups of daughters of the Confederacy, Southern groups of women who decide this is something that needs to be memorialized. And so I want us to, I want us to kind of see that it's not just historic men who created these narratives that we have been fed. And so you have, Daughters of the Confederacy and other Southern women's groups who raise money to raise up statues in the South in honor of Confederate generals. And so this was part of that idea that it's not just through policy or through government that these narratives are told, but it's also through the arts and also through media at the time. Thank you. All right, so in the 1920s, we have the rise of these groups that are raising money for statues, right, through art and media to honor the generals of the Lost Cause. So we also have the rise of the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, which is explicitly formed as the literal expression of white Christian nationalism. And we see this not just in practice, but we also see it in the culture. It is very surprising how many Supreme Court portraits you can find of different Supreme Court justices, and how some will very proudly show their KKK robes, or different lawmakers in southern states taking their official portraits in their robes. And so, again, this reminds us of how normalized it was, and how this was not considered a threat and a concern. And Jeff's got a little tidbit for y'all if he'd like to share.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite subjects. But in the 1920s, there were 3 to 6 million KKK members, and it wasn't just for white supremacists, but it was anti-Catholic. It was an anti-Catholic movement, and it was right after Birth of the Nation came out, the first movie, Birth of a Nation, that helped fuel the rise of the KKK and Christian nationalism. And as a Detroiter, in the 1920s, KKK almost took over the entire Detroit City Council, if it weren't for the Protestant churches that marched against them. So they almost took over a whole city in Detroit. So anyway.
And so again, like I mentioned, this is a direct action of white Christian nationalism. But also, what do we see on those robes? What are the types of symbols that we see? Crosses on fires, crosses on hoods. A lot of ritual that is tied to a narrow understanding of Christianity. And so again, there's this direct tie, right, of justifying terrorist behavior using scripture. All right, so we're going to move to the 1950s and 60s. We have the rise of the civil rights movement. That is, led not just by Baptist pastors like Dr. King and his friends, his comrades like John Lewis and others, but we also have folks who are coming at this through promoting education, right, like Fannie Lou Hamer. We have folks like Medgar Evers and folks like Malcolm X. So this idea that this movement was just one particular person, because when we think of civil rights, we think of Dr. King, but we often forget the wave of people who were getting in good trouble, to quote John Lewis, of what it took to get us to that moment, right? And so also in this moment, how does the moderate white church respond to this moment? There's a famous letter from a jail about this. Yes. Yeah. Do we know? No. Not great, famously. I'm sorry? Yes. Yes, thank you, Carl. So the moderate white church tells this movement, you need to calm it down. You have to do this more civilly. You need to find another way to fight you need to find a peaceful way to fight for your rights. So I went to school at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama. I went to school down the street from First Baptist Church of Birmingham. where the pastor was known as someone who came out openly condemning Dr. King. And the response was Dr. King writing his famous letter from a Birmingham jail in response to this, and in response to all of the moderate white Christians asking them to be a little bit more bold about this. What's interesting about this is that we were told to read this before freshman year, before we got to Stanford, and then we did nothing with it. The symbolism is loud. Yes?
The book that came out was called Why We Can't Wait by Martin Luther King Jr. It has his letter from the Birmingham jail. And the great phrase in there says, "You continue to tell me to wait, but what we have found is when you say wait, that means never." And it's a very, very prophetic letter, and it's very, very contemporary. Just pull up AI, just put letter from the Birmingham jail. It's just very, very profound.
Yeah, okay, so we're up to the 70s, and we'll move slightly quickly through this. So we get to the 1970s, and this is where we really see the rise of the Christian right. So we were talking earlier today at dinner about a couple of things. One is that in the 1970s, historically, Protestants, and particularly Southern Baptists, didn't really care about reproductive rights or abortion. It does not become an issue that evangelicals care about until after 1974, when Bob Jones University loses a Supreme Court case telling them they can no longer have tax exemption status if they continue to have segregated schools. So after desegregation, we have schools saying we're having schools desegregate, right? So we have black students going into historically white schools. And as a response to that, conservative Christians begin to create private schools for white-only students. And so there's a history of that in Georgia. There's a history of that in Virginia. And because they were considered technically churches or like religious institutions, so tax exempt, the Supreme Court decided in 1974 that you could not be tax exempt and also be a segregated school. And so before 1974, there's actually a record of, who's that famous Southern Baptist pastor in Dallas? I meant to look up his name after we talked about it. But he is interviewed and asked what his thoughts were about abortion. And his response is, that is up to the person and their family. It is none of our business to to decide what somebody does with their body. That was 1974. In 1972, Southern Baptists vote at their annual conference to say that abortion is not a topic that the church should be talking about, and is not something that they should tell, again, what the church does not get to decide what a person does with their body. Again, this is 1972 and 1974. And so when Bob Jones loses that Supreme Court case, evangelicals decide, well, we lost the race war. We need something else. And so they caught on to abortion and reproductive rights as their cause. That's one that gets me upset. I'm sorry?
Why do they have to have a cause?
I'm so glad you asked that, Netta.
Like a political cause.
Yeah, so this idea, again, that having power, right? And so it's not just about reproductive rights. It still comes down to white supremacy. Because even there's someone that y'all should all know about, Robert Schneck. He is someone who was a former Christian nationalist. And he talks about how the root of being anti-abortion and anti-reproductive rights was still rooted in racism. And we can talk about that later, but for time's sake, we're going to move it along. So that's how we see the rise of conservative Christians really having a role in policy and in American politics. I'm sorry?
With Schenck, it's important to say that they identified abortion as the dividing topic and to get people upset. And then later he realized, for that one issue, we will give our souls to the Republicans or whoever on that one issue, and you can do whatever else you want. And later he realized, oh my God, we sold our souls to the devil for that one issue. So he changed his.
Yeah. He's a dear friend. And it is very hopeful that there are some Christian nationalists who, you can plant the seed and they can change their minds. Right, so that's in the 70s, that's where we see the rise of the religious right and its influence in American politics and policy. And then we skip, a couple of years to 2025 to today, and now we see an increased attention and scrutiny on white Christian nationalism due to the role of anti-LGBTQ legislation, other policies, including anti-immigration legislation, anti-reproductive rights legislation, and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Yes.
So it sounds like these issues are really dog whistles. They're really ways to rile up certain people's prejudice, racism, and all that, but they're using it as a tool to achieve their goals.
Right. Exactly. Right, exactly. Yes. Right. So Judy outside said, for example, one of the examples is the anti-trans bills that are coming out as one of the dog whistles that they're currently using to fearmonger. And that's what we talked about earlier, right, is that there's use of fearmongering and othering, fearmongering and othering, and the possibility that a group that has been the majority for so long could, heaven forbid, become the minority at some point. All right, so we're going to move on. I'll just go over this briefly just to get an idea. So if you're wondering, well, who is a Christian nationalist, and who would rightly call themselves that? You have the slide with pictures of those folks, and I'm going to invite you to Google them at a different time. And I also invite you to look up, to scan this QR code to our website at Americans United. This is everything you need to know about the shadow network of Christian nationalists who have been doing this work for decades. At this particular link, you will find the information of all of the organizations that these folks run. The names of billionaires who have been funding this since the 70s, because this work does not get done without money, and so there you will find a bunch of information about who the main characters are in Christian nationalism. So we're going to move along. All right, so we're gonna skip this part because we have so many questions, and we'll ask those at the end. All right. So how does a movement like Christian nationalism grow? Like we said, through fear-mongering, through othering, reframing immigration and pluralism as a threat to the moral majority. So this idea that we have outsiders coming into our country and making the historic majority now the minority in this country. In fact, I think a couple of days ago I read in the news, 1 out of 5 people in America are Latino. I personally think that's cool as a Latina, but there are some people who don't like that. So evoking a sense of racial threat to becoming a minority, like I just said, and seeing LGBTQ inclusion in policy change as a threat to traditional family Christian values. And these are things that y'all have mentioned previously when we did the shout out of what white Christian nationalism is. I'm going to let y'all read through these slides of what dominionism is. I will read kind of some of the notes that I have. Excuse me. So essentially, dominionism can be summarized as the theocratic idea that Christians are called by God to exercise dominion over every aspect of society by taking control of political and cultural institutions. For example, over the role of government, the form and content of public education, and eliminating rights related to bodily autonomy. It envisions a very different society than one defined by democratic aspirations, by inequality for all people. And when you hear conservatives talk about a biblical worldview, they are often talking about this belief that shapes and informs an organization's politics. So biblical worldview is another way of saying dominionism. Under the big umbrella of dominionism, there are two particular ideologies that fall under the larger umbrella. So there's Christian Reconstructionism and the New Apostolic Reformation, NAR. So the first one, Christian Reconstructionism, is the idea that, did somebody say? Okay, so it's the idea that theocracy should be something that is ruled over all of the world. So that is more of a global understanding of it in a global movement. And the one I want to talk about briefly is the New Apostolic Reformation. So this is the group that came up with the strategy of the Seven Mountain Mandate. So it is this idea that family, religion, education, media, art, and economics and government all should have the right type of Christian influence. Apologies that the mountain graphic on this slide does not have 7 points. I could not find one that had 7 points. So it's this idea that the right type of Christian needs to have influence over these particular aspects of life. I'm going to introduce y'all to a Gen Z term, or actually, I think it's this current young generation. So this is something that my youth always like to tell me, that it's not that deep. And I fear that it is, my friends. So when we talk about how this idea of white Christian nationalism has seeped into particular aspects of life, and maybe we don't think it is because it's just an innocent phrase. It's just a painting. It's just a term. It's just some phrase that people say they don't really mean anything by it. So the more that we continue to think that it's not that deep, we are allowing ourselves and conditioning ourselves to not think about where these understandings or ideologies are coming from. And so I don't think we have time to do this particular exercise, but I wanted to invite us to see where we see the Seven Mountain Mandate influence culture today. One of the things we talked about in the last presentation I did was Jimmy Kimmel his show being canceled, and then it's back, but at the time it wasn't. So this idea that media and arts were being suppressed. The Kennedy Center, right? So we have these ideas, right, of how this is happening and how Project 2025 has become a part of that. But again, knowing that this has been a part of the movement and the culture for decades. And I do want to end with or at least this particular part, because we're going to talk about "So What," to quote Miles Davis' song. So we talked about this again at dinner. So one of the men who coined the term and the strategy of the Seven Mountain Mandate, Lance Wallnau, who is also another person who prides himself in being a Christian nationalist, is the first person in, I believe it was 2015, who equated Donald Trump at the time to a King Cyrus. And so if you've ever wondered how evangelical conservative Christians went from never Trump to Trump will get our policies and ideology to happen in this country, it is when Lance Wallnau and folks like him equated President Trump to King Cyrus. If you don't know your Bible that well, King Cyrus was the king of Persia who then conquers Babylon. And remember, the Israelites are under occupation in the Empire of Babylon. But King Cyrus was known as somebody who allowed occupied people to observe their religion and their culture. And so it is under King Cyrus that the Israelites are allowed to return home and to rebuild the temple. And so it's this idea that Trump will never be a person who identifies as a person of faith. But with his power, we are able to get the mission of God to come to fruition because we have a secular King Cyrus. And so that's how we see kind of the rise of conservative Christians in support of Trump, with Lance Wallnau and other Christian nationalists at the time equating him to that. So, as Judy mentioned, we're here to know what this means for us and what is next. I know this is a very heavy topic, and this was, a very broad understanding of Christian nationalism, and there's still so much more, right, because it is an iceberg of a topic. But I hope you were able to kind of see those connections throughout history and through policy. And so what does this mean next? Like I mentioned, for some people, this is maybe a topic that you are just learning about for the first time tonight. For others, this is something you've been following for years or maybe a few months now. And it is still something that is scary, but I think there is a power in information, and there's a power of being able to name it. And again, turning around and being able to talk about it with friends and family and community. Because if it's not talked about, it stays in the dark. And we know that, things in the dark must come to light. And so this is an opportunity for you to be able to understand just a broad understanding of it. And if there's ever a particular aspect of this particular topic that you want to learn more about, Americans United is a source for you, I hope, in learning how to continue to get involved in combating Christian nationalism and religious freedom and church-state separation. And there are two ways that you can do that. One, or there's several ways. I offered y'all some links to learn more about the Shadow Network, to really understand kind of where this is coming from, where the history is, following the money, following the leaders of who are influencing this movement right now and in decades past. Also, I want to invite you to our Summit for Religious Freedom. It is our annual conference, and it actually is happening in Alexandria this spring. It is a conference where we have folks from all across the advocacy space of religious freedom who come together and teach us about the different aspects of this work, because this work does not happen alone, but together in community, with all of us in different lanes doing this in different ways. Also, I'd like to invite you, if you are interested in being part as a person of faith or of philosophy or any faith, to join the Faith Leaders United group, FLU, unfortunately for short. Don't catch the flu, join the flu. It is the faith base of Americans United. That's what I manage and run. This is a way, again, my hope is that it is an opportunity to train and teach people of faith or and many other philosophies about what true religious freedom is, and how to tie it into your own story, because I think oftentimes we think it doesn't necessarily affect me, but there are so many ways that this understanding of religious freedom is intersectional in our lives. And like we just learned through that very brief history of time, we see why it's so important to understand why religious freedom is important. So if you want to scan those codes, please feel free to sign up for one or the other or both. I encourage you to attend SURF or join the Faith Leaders United group to stay up to date on how you can continue to be an advocate for religious freedom with the tools and resources and passions that you have. So thank you again for letting me talk to y'all about a brief history of Christian nationalism.